There was a reason Jack had retired. He had walked away from war, chaos, and men who saluted him just before betraying him, and he told himself it was all in the past. He never thought he'd hear his daughter's voice screaming his name while an alien raider dragged her into the sky, and he certainly didn't think that the only weapon he'd have would be a half-broken wrench clutched in his grease-stained hand. That was the hook, the instant a quiet scrapyard became a battleground. And Jack knew the past wasn't done with him after all. His daughter's terrified voice was already fading as the raiders' gunship engines roared, lifting off from the middle of a dusty earth market while the terrified townsfolk froze, their eyes wide, their hands trembling, and their bodies still locked in place by some alien stun device. Only Jack could move. Only Jack had been outside the stun radius. And as he sprinted forward with that wrench raised like a sword, the gunship's hatch slammed shut and its engines blasted him back, throwing him hard into a pile of scrap that rattled and clattered as he hit the ground. The dust hadn't even settled when the last thing he saw was Sarah's wide eyes staring at him through a porthole, her face defiant but scared. Jack lay there a moment longer than he should have, catching his breath while the villagers slowly began to stir again, their paralysis wearing off, and soon they all crowded around him, murmuring in fear. One of them, a wiry old vendor, leaned down with shaking hands and asked what they all wanted to know. Who would stop the raiders? Jack stood up without a word, brushing rust flakes from his face, and walked straight toward his workshop. Inside, the place was dark and cluttered with parts, old vehicles, and junk that had no place in a modern world. But among the clutter was a dusty sheet thrown over a long-forgotten relic, an old combat shuttle, a patchwork mess of metal plates and hand-welded repairs. They used to call this ship Rust Bucket back when Jack still had a squadron, back when people still saluted when he walked by. Those days were gone, and the Rust Bucket hadn't flown in years, but Jack's fingers moved quickly, flipping switches and checking lines, ignoring sparks that spat out as old systems struggled to come alive. It was funny, in a grim way, because everyone who had seen Jack lately knew he had no rank, no command, no respect left in any corner of the galaxy. He was a ghost, a washed-up soldier running a scrapyard, tinkering with old machines for a few coins. But none of that mattered anymore. They had taken his daughter, and he knew one thing. You don't need rank to burn a raider crew out of existence. You just need determination and the right tools. Jack's battered shuttle screamed into life with a horrible metallic groan, and when he radioed out, his voice was low and cold. "You took my daughter," he said, "and I don't care who you think you are. Watch what a man with nothing left can do." While Jack prepared for takeoff, Sarah was already improvising her own defiance. Inside the alien ship, she sat chained to a bench, but that didn't stop her from running her mouth. She made sarcastic comments about the smell, the damp walls, and especially about the captain's choice of ridiculous purple trousers, which earned her a slap from one of the guards. But every time they tried to intimidate her, Sarah smiled wider, knowing somehow her father was coming. She had always believed Jack could fix anything, whether it was a broken bike or a failing generator. This was no different in her mind, even though she was scared deep down. Back on Earth, Jack lifted off in the Rust Bucket, leaving a streak of fire across the sky that made the villagers stare up in disbelief. The ship wobbled, creaked, and made sounds that should not come from anything airborne, but it flew. As he reached orbit, Jack tapped an old data console and brought up galactic comm frequencies. The raiders were sloppy. They broadcast their victory openly on pirate channels, boasting about capturing a human girl, laughing about how Earthlings were too primitive to respond. They didn't even bother masking their jump coordinates, and that was their first mistake. Jack punched in the hyperspace coordinates, fingers flying over controls, while muttering to himself about how everything felt rustier and clunkier than he remembered. But there was no hesitation in his mind. No rank, no resources, no support, but that didn't matter. He had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. And deep down, Jack knew that was more dangerous than an entire fleet. His first stop would be a pirate moon on the edge of known space, a scummy place where raiders docked and traded in slaves, weapons, and things best left unnamed. Jack had been there once, long ago, and he knew exactly who to talk to for information, though it would probably involve punching some faces first. Meanwhile, aboard the raider's ship, Sarah had managed to slip a hairpin from her pocket, working at her wrist restraints behind her back while cracking jokes at the guards. She had her father's spirit, that same defiance, that same refusal to surrender even when outgunned and outnumbered. But even her bravado wavered slightly when she heard the guards discussing what awaited her. She would be auctioned at a slave market, sold to the highest bidder, a spectacle for alien criminals. Yet even then, Sarah whispered to herself, "Dad is coming." In hyperspace, Jack sat back in the pilot's seat, staring into the swirling tunnel of light ahead. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an old photograph of him and Sarah when she was 5, her face covered in ice cream, smiling as she sat on his shoulders. He placed it on the dash, just above the cracked and flickering console. He spoke aloud, even though no one could hear him. "Hold on, Sarah. Your old man is coming. No rank, no mercy." Behind him, the engines rumbled dangerously, warning lights flashing on the console, and something in the back of the ship exploded softly with a puff of smoke, but Jack didn't flinch. He just tightened his grip on the control stick and pushed the rust bucket harder, straight toward the pirate moon, where this mission would begin. Out in the blackness of space, the galaxy had already forgotten Jack's name, but they were about to remember it in a way they would never forget. The pirate moon hung in space like a rotting fruit, wrapped in a thin shroud of mist and glowing weakly with the lights of disreputable taverns, smuggler docks, and scrapyards where stolen ships were stripped without mercy. Jack's shuttle dropped out of hyperspace with a shudder that rattled every bolt and seam in the battered hull, but he didn't hesitate. He guided the rust bucket toward a landing pad on the outskirts of the main settlement, a maze of twisting alleys and crumbling buildings known as Crater's Edge. No one there cared who you were, only what you could offer or steal. As he approached the landing bay, a squat, tusked alien waved him down, demanding docking clearance and authorization codes. Jack flipped a switch and replied with a code that hadn't been valid in decades, barking orders in the clipped tone of an officer who expected obedience. The alien guard blinked, confused, staring at the outdated ID on Jack's view screen, which bore a picture of a much younger Jack and a childish doodle scrawled in crayon across the bottom, a doodle Sarah had made years ago. The alien hesitated just long enough for Jack to drop the shuttle roughly onto the pad and exit before authorization could be properly checked. Jack's boots hit the moon's dusty surface as he took a deep breath. The air smelled of fuel, sweat, and broken promises. He strode forward into the narrow alleys, knowing exactly where he was headed. Deep in the heart of Crater's Edge was a tavern called the Bent Spanner, run by a former smuggler named Drax, an informant who always claimed neutrality but had sold out everyone he'd ever met. Drax would know where the Gruthan Raiders had taken Sarah next, and Jack was willing to pay whatever it cost to get that information, or take it by force. Inside the Bent Spanner, the air was thick with smoke and conversation in a dozen alien languages. A band of three-eyed musicians played something that sounded like a dying engine, while two reptilian creatures arm-wrestled at a corner table, their tails twitching impatiently. Jack walked straight to the bar and fixed his gaze on Drax, who was polishing a glass with a rag that looked dirtier than the glass itself. Drax grinned as he recognized Jack. Well, he drawled. "If it isn't the ghost of Rust Bucket himself. I thought you were dead or drunk in some back alley." Jack's reply was simple. "My daughter. Where is she?" The smile slid from Drax's face, but only for a moment. Then he shrugged and leaned in close. "She was taken by the Grithins," he whispered, "but information like that isn't free anymore, old friend." Before Jack could respond, the door to the tavern swung open and a group of bounty hunters filed in, led by a tall, scarred woman with cybernetic eyes that glowed red. She announced loudly that there was a bounty on Jack's head, and she planned to collect. Drax stepped back quickly, revealing his true colors yet again. The trap was obvious, but Jack didn't waste time complaining. Instead, he smiled grimly and reached behind the bar, grabbing a crate filled with carbonated alien soda bottles. With a single sharp motion, he popped all their caps and kicked the crate straight at the bounty hunter's feet. The reaction was immediate and ridiculous. The high-pressure soda exploded in a geyser of sticky foam, knocking weapons from hands and causing several bounty hunters to slip and crash into tables. Jack vaulted over the bar and into the thick of the confusion, elbowing and punching his way through. Chairs shattered, glasses flew, and the band kept playing as if nothing unusual was happening. The scarred woman fired a shot that barely missed Jack's head, scorching a hole in the ceiling, but he didn't stop. He reached Drax and grabbed the informant by the collar, dragging him bodily out of the tavern while the bounty hunters scrambled to their feet behind them. Outside, Jack slammed Drax against a wall and demanded coordinates. Drax, choking and gasping, coughed up the location of the raiders' hideout, a cargo station orbiting a red giant star 2 systems over. Jack didn't waste breath thanking him. He dropped the informant in the dust and ran back toward the rust bucket, ducking laser blasts that sizzled through the air around him as the bounty hunters emerged from the tavern, furious and embarrassed. He threw himself up the ramp of the shuttle, slamming the hatch closed just as a plasma bolt struck the hull, scorching a deep black scar into the side. Jack strapped in and fired the engines immediately, ignoring every warning light on the dashboard. The battered shuttle lifted off in a cloud of dust and debris, twisting sharply to avoid incoming fire as Jack punched the throttle and shot skyward. In orbit, he barely had time to plot the jump to hyperspace as several pirate ships rose from the moon's surface, intent on intercepting him. The rust bucket groaned and creaked, parts shaking loose and sparks flying from the console, but Jack kept his focus, fingers flying over the controls. The coordinates Drax had given him glowed on the screen, the Gruthan Raiders' hideout. He locked them in and hit the hyperspace drive just as a pirate gunship locked weapons on him. The stars streaked into lines, and the rust bucket lurched forward, leaving the pirate moon behind and jumping into the void. Inside the cramped cockpit, Jack sat back for a moment, wiping sweat from his brow. He glanced at the picture of Sarah still taped to the dash, and the sight of her innocent smile hardened his resolve even more. Out there, somewhere in the cold reaches of space, his daughter was waiting, counting on him, maybe even losing hope. But he would not fail her. No rank, no fleet, no mercy. Just a father who knew that sometimes you didn't need an army if you were angry enough. And Jack had never been angrier in his entire life. The rust bucket shuddered again as the hyperspace tunnel twisted around him. But Jack only leaned forward, eyes locked on the navigation readout. The pirate moon had been just the beginning. The real fight was waiting at that cargo station, and Jack intended to show the Gruthans exactly what they had unleashed. Ask ChatGPT. The cargo station orbiting the red giant was a monument to greed and cruelty, a sprawling patchwork of steel plates and docking arms, buzzing with ships and shadowy traders. It was here that the Gruthan Raiders had brought Sarah, chaining her inside a holding cell deep in the bowels of the station while preparing her for auction. The corridors echoed with the chatter of aliens from dozens of species, merchants haggling, guards growling orders, and auctioneers rehearsing their grotesque pitches. Inside her cell, Sarah sat cross-legged, feigning boredom even as her mind raced. She watched the guards outside, memorizing their patterns and movements, calculating how much time she would have if her father arrived and chaos erupted. She had seen the look in his eyes when she was dragged away, and despite her fear, she trusted that look. Jack wouldn't stop. He couldn't. At the same moment, far above the station, the rust bucket emerged from hyperspace with a violent lurch that knocked tools and debris loose in the cockpit. Jack steadied the controls and surveyed the scene. Dozens of ships orbited the station, from sleek smuggling craft to rusted freighters, and patrol drones circled lazily, scanning for threats. Jack knew he could not simply barge in and start shooting. He would have to be smart, reckless maybe, but smart. His fingers danced across the controls as he initiated an identity spoof, disguising the rust bucket as an eccentric collector's yacht, complete with false credentials that listed him as Baron Jarvis of the Outer Rim, an entirely fictitious identity he had cooked up years ago for a different scam. A grin crept across his face as the station's landing controller cleared him to dock, probably eager for whatever ridiculous riches this so-called Baron might spend at the auction. As the rust bucket clanged awkwardly into its assigned berth, Jack pulled on a long cloak from a locker, concealing his battered flight suit. He needed to blend in, at least for a few minutes. He stepped off the ramp and immediately felt the oppressive heat radiating from the red giant, even this far from the star. The station's gravity felt uneven, and the floors beneath his boots creaked ominously. But Jack kept walking, weaving through the crowds, eyes scanning for familiar signs of Gruthan guards. Their armor was distinctive, heavy, and brutalist, and soon enough he spotted two of them posted outside a security checkpoint leading deeper into the station. But he didn't go straight at them. Instead, he headed toward the main auction hall, knowing that Sarah would be paraded there like property unless he intervened quickly. Inside the auction chamber, the atmosphere was appalling, a mix of spectacle and depravity. Buyers from across the galaxy lounged in private booths, sipping exotic drinks and casually inspecting holographic previews of the slaves to be sold. The auctioneer stood on an elevated platform, his voice oily and cheerful as he extolled the virtues of his merchandise. What made Jack freeze for half a heartbeat was the sight of the auctioneer himself, a human wearing a diplomatic insignia from Earth's outer colonies. Jack recognized him instantly. Ambassador Hale, a man he had once served under, a man who had been responsible for disbanding Jack's unit after a disastrous mission years ago. It was Hale who had labeled Jack a liability and ensured his exile from military service. And now here he was, smiling as he prepared to sell Jack's daughter. The fury that surged through Jack almost made him lose focus, but he forced himself to breathe. No rank, no mercy. He would get Sarah out first, and then he would deal with Hale. Jack moved quickly, slipping behind the curtain that led to the auction's preparation area. He found rows of cages filled with frightened captives, but only one mattered. Sarah sat inside a reinforced holding cell at the far end, her eyes widening when she saw him. But to her credit, she didn't cry out. She simply gave him a look that said, "Finally." Jack crouched beside the cell and pulled out a small tool from his belt, a high-frequency cutter meant for slicing through bulkhead panels. It wasn't ideal for prison bars, but Jack had modified it as he modified everything. Sparks flew as he worked, cutting through the locking mechanism with ruthless efficiency. Just as the last bar gave way, a blaring alarm shattered the moment. Jack cursed under his breath, realizing Hale must have noticed the intrusion or spotted him on a security feed. The guards came quickly, boots pounding metal, voices barking in a dozen alien tongues. Jack pulled Sarah free and thrust a small blaster into her hands, one of his backup weapons. "Stick close and shoot anything that points a gun at you," he told her, a grin flashing despite the danger. Sarah gave him a look of sheer glee, despite the situation, and nodded. Together, they moved fast, weaving through corridors as station security converged. Sarah proved surprisingly adept, managing to shoot out a security camera while running, laughing breathlessly as she did. Their path to the rust bucket was blocked almost immediately. The Gruthan guards were better organized than Jack had hoped, cutting off every obvious escape route. But Jack knew this place, knew how these stations were built. He ducked into a maintenance shaft, dragging Sarah with him, crawling through tight spaces and sliding down ladder wells that smelled of oil and sweat. They emerged into a cargo bay filled with stacked crates and containers. Jack paused for only a second before spotting what he needed. A cargo loader, parked and unattended, its engine still warm. Without hesitation, he lifted Sarah onto the loader's platform and climbed aboard himself, hot-wiring the controls in seconds. The loader rumbled to life and surged forward, smashing through the thin wall that separated the cargo bay from the outer docking ring. Alarms blared louder, but Jack didn't care. The rust bucket loomed ahead, battered and imperfect but alive, the one place in this forsaken station where they would be safe. As the loader screeched to a halt beside the ship's ramp, Jack jumped off, scooping Sarah up and sprinting aboard. He barely had time to close the hatch before a squad of guards appeared behind him, weapons ready. The first shots struck the outer hull, but Jack was already in the pilot's seat, fingers flying across the controls. The rust bucket rose on sputtering engines and lurched forward, smashing through the station's docking clamps. More shots sizzled past the cockpit windows, some finding their mark and causing sparks to burst from panels around Jack and Sarah. But the ship kept climbing, clawing its way back into open space. As the stars opened before them, Jack finally allowed himself a breath, glancing over at Sarah, who sat beside him, grinning despite the chaos, a smudge of dirt across her cheek. "You're crazy, Dad," she said, laughter bubbling up. Jack smiled grimly. "Takes one to know one, kid." But it wasn't over. Not yet. Jack knew the raiders would not let this insult stand. The bounty on their heads would double, triple even. But he didn't care. For now, Sarah was free, and he was not done proving that a man with no rank and no mercy was still the most dangerous enemy in the galaxy. The rust bucket limped through the void, its systems battered and warning lights flashing across every console. Inside the cockpit, Jack kept one hand on the flight controls and the other flicking switches frantically as he rerouted failing circuits. Beside him, Sarah watched intently, not quite understanding the specifics, but sensing the urgency. They had escaped the auction, but escape was not freedom. The cargo station had broadcast a wideband distress call before they jumped, and by now every bounty hunter and pirate in this sector would know exactly who Jack was and what he had done. He had humiliated the Gruthans, stolen from them right under their noses, and shattered their auction. That kind of insult demanded revenge. Jack understood this wasn't over. The real hunt was about to begin. As they drifted through the swirling debris belt of an abandoned mining field, Sarah looked out the viewport and spoke softly, asking how many were coming after them. Jack hesitated before answering, weighing the truth against what she could handle. Dozens, maybe hundreds, he admitted finally, and not just raiders. The bounty was now high enough to attract every desperate and dangerous soul between here and the core systems. Sarah nodded, her face serious in a way that broke his heart a little. She was so young, but already the galaxy was forcing her to grow up faster than he had ever wanted. Yet even as he watched her process this, her mouth quirked into a crooked grin. "So we're famous now?" she said. Jack laughed despite himself. "Infamous," he corrected, but the grin was contagious. Their brief moment of levity evaporated as the proximity alarm screamed suddenly, red lights pulsing and a new wave of tension flooding the cockpit. A sleek ship, far more advanced than anything Jack could fly, dropped out of hyperspace directly in their path. It was a bounty hunter gunship, armed to the teeth and painted in ominous black, with a long history of vicious kills engraved on its hull. A voice crackled through the comms, smooth and cold. "Surrender the girl," the voice demanded. "No mercy if you hesitate." Jack knew the type of hunter this was. A professional, not some pirate looking for a quick payday. This one would fight smart, precise, and relentless. There would be no bluffing here. Without wasting time, Jack slammed the throttle forward and rolled the rust bucket hard to port, throwing the old ship into a wild spin that narrowly avoided the first barrage of plasma bolts. Sarah yelped but held on, her eyes wide as she watched her father fly with a reckless edge that bordered on insanity. Jack muttered under his breath as he forced the battered ship through a debris field, scraping metal and sparks trailing from the hull. The hunter followed easily, weapons locking on again, and Jack could feel the inevitability of the confrontation closing in around them. They couldn't outrun this one, not in a straight fight. But Jack had never planned to fight fair. Deep in a mining field, he spotted what he needed. An old fuel rig, long abandoned, its tanks still partially full of volatile gases. Jack wove through the wreckage deliberately, making himself an obvious target, allowing the hunter to close in and prepare for the kill. Then he whispered to Sarah to hold tight and cover her ears. With one hand, he activated the rust bucket's emergency beacon, transmitting a distress signal on an open frequency. It was a gamble, one last desperate trick. The hunter took the bait, laughing over the comms about how easy this was going to be. Jack counted down in his head as he waited for the hunter's next shot, feeling the tension coil tighter and tighter until it almost snapped. Then he pulled the rust bucket hard around the fuel rig, cutting engines entirely and drifting into a lazy spin that brought them broadside to the massive tanks. At that exact moment, he fired a single shot from the Rust Bucket's aging but still functional railgun, striking one of the tanks directly. The explosion was immediate and catastrophic. A plume of fire and debris engulfed the Hunter's ship before its pilot could react, tearing the sleek vessel apart in a brilliant cascade of light. The shockwave rocked the Rust Bucket, slamming them sideways and sending sparks flying through the cockpit. But Jack gritted his teeth and rode out. As the flames died down and only drifting wreckage remained, Jack allowed himself a slow breath. Sarah whooped with glee, her face flushed with excitement. "That was insane," she shouted. "That was the coolest thing I've ever seen." Jack smiled, though his heart was still pounding and sweat dripped down his face. He reached out and ruffled her hair affectionately. Not bad for an old man with a Rust Bucket, huh? But even as they shared that brief victory, Jack knew this was just the beginning. If one hunter had found them so quickly, more would follow soon. The bounty was growing by the minute, and soon entire pirate fleets might be drawn to their trail like sharks to blood. He needed a plan, something bigger than just running. Running wouldn't save Sarah, not in the long run. They would have to strike back. In the hours that followed, Jack set the Rust Bucket on autopilot and pored over old star charts, recalling rumors and legends he had picked up over years of drifting through the outer sectors. He needed somewhere dangerous enough to discourage pursuit, somewhere he could turn the tables and make his enemies come to him on his terms. And then he remembered a place: the graveyard, an ancient battlefield filled with the wrecks of thousands of warships from forgotten war, drifting around a dead star. No sane pilot went there anymore. The magnetic fields alone would fry most ship systems unless you knew the exact safe corridors. But Jack had flown there once, long ago, and he still remembered the way. He set a course immediately, explaining the plan to Sarah as he worked. "We're going to lure them," he told her, "every last one of them. And when they all gather, thinking they've cornered us, we'll turn this around." Sarah listened carefully, her young face set with determination. She wasn't scared anymore. She was ready. The Rust Bucket shuddered again as it prepared for hyperspace, and Jack took one last look at the stars outside. They had underestimated him because he had no rank, no command, and no one to back him up. But that was their mistake. A man with nothing left and a reason to fight was the most dangerous enemy of all. Jack pushed the throttle forward, and the stars stretched into lines as they leapt toward the graveyard, where the next chapter of this fight would unfold. Ask ChatGPT. The graveyard was exactly as Jack remembered, a dark graveyard of metal orbiting the cold corpse of a dead star. Hulks of ancient warships drifted in slow spirals, their once proud hulls shattered and rusting, their long-forgotten flags still fluttering from masts that no longer mattered. The entire region was wrapped in electromagnetic distortions, dangerous enough to fry navigation systems and communications gear unless you knew exactly how to thread the path. Jack knew. He had flown this gauntlet years ago during a disastrous mission, and the scars from that flight had never quite healed. But this time was different. This time it was his battlefield. As the Rust Bucket eased through the twisted corridors of wreckage, Jack worked feverishly at the console, laying traps as he went. He programmed remote drones to drift silently among the debris, each one rigged to detonate in a precise pattern. Every move he made was deliberate, every decision tied to a larger plan. Sarah watched, fascinated, sometimes handing him tools or double-checking readouts, her young face lit by flickering console lights. "Dad," she said suddenly, "are we really going to fight all of them here?" Jack smiled grimly. "No," he answered, "we're going to make them fight themselves." He explained that his plan wasn't about defeating a fleet with a single battered shuttle. That would be impossible. But what was possible was turning the hunters' greed and pride against them. He was going to transmit a signal, an irresistible lure, a false claim that the galaxy's greatest treasure was hidden in the heart of the graveyard, a relic so valuable that whoever controlled it would command untold riches and power. It didn't matter that it was a lie. The bounty hunters and raiders chasing him wouldn't stop to question it. They would come. They would fight each other to be first. And in the chaos, Jack and Sarah would slip away unnoticed, leaving behind only destruction. The message was simple and direct, broadcast across every pirate and smuggler frequency Jack could access. The signal contained doctored scans showing the legendary jewel of Ryloth, a myth, a treasure no one had ever seen but that everyone believed in, buried in the heart of an ancient flagship deep inside the graveyard. Within minutes of sending the transmission, Jack's sensors lit up, ships dropping out of hyperspace at the fringes of the dead system. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Small raiders, heavy freighters, sleek bounty hunter craft, all converging like vultures on a carcass. Jack and Sarah watched from the shadows, hidden among the wreckage, as the feeding frenzy began. The first shots were fired within minutes as rival gangs fought over territory, accusing each other of trying to steal the prize. Explosions lit the darkness, casting flickering light over the twisted hulls of ancient warships. More ships arrived, drawn by the chaos, each one adding fuel to the growing inferno of greed and violence. Jack piloted the rust bucket carefully through the wreckage, staying close to his network of booby-trapped drones, waiting for the right moment to trigger them. As they drifted silently past a shattered cruiser, Sarah pointed out a familiar silhouette among the arriving ships. A Gruthan flagship, massive and heavily armed, its hull painted with the same insignia as the raiders who had taken her. "There they are," Sarah said, her voice low and dangerous. Jack nodded. The Gruthans were here to reclaim their prize and their pride. But they had no idea that their pride was about to be their downfall. Jack waited until the Gruthan ship pushed deeper into the graveyard, its escorts fanning out to secure the debris field. Then he activated the first sequence. A ripple of detonations swept through the nearest wrecks, tearing apart smaller ships and sending shockwaves that knocked others into each other. The Gruthans responded with fury, opening fire on everything in sight, convinced they were under attack by rival pirates. The chaos spread quickly, and soon the entire graveyard was ablaze with battle. Jack used the confusion perfectly, guiding the rust bucket through narrow corridors of debris while triggering more explosions in his wake. Sarah sat beside him, gripping her harness, but her face lit with fierce joy as she watched her father outwit ship after ship. "They're fighting each other," she said with wonder. "They're tearing each other apart." Jack nodded grimly. "That's the plan. Let them destroy themselves." But it wasn't over yet. The Gruthan flagship spotted the rust bucket at last, recognizing Jack's battered ship even amid the chaos. It turned its heavy guns toward them, firing with lethal precision. Jack jerked the controls hard, weaving through wreckage as plasma blasts seared past the hull. The old shuttle groaned in protest, systems failing one by one as Jack pushed it beyond safe limits. "We can't take many more hits, Dad," Sarah said, worry creeping in her voice. Jack didn't answer right away. His mind was racing, calculating trajectories, timing, and distances. Then he saw it, a massive wreck, the shattered hulk of a dreadnought, hanging dead ahead. "Hold on tight," he told Sarah, and dove straight for the wreck. The Gruthan flagship followed, determined to finish what it had started. Jack flew the rust bucket through a narrow opening in the dreadnought's hull, twisting and spinning through corridors barely wider than the shuttle itself. The Gruthans followed, their much larger ships scraping and tearing at the wreck's edges as it tried to pursue. Jack grinned fiercely. They were too big, too slow, and too arrogant. He triggered his last sequence, a line of charges he had laid earlier along the dreadnought's spine. The explosions ran like a lightning bolt through the ancient wreck, splitting it in two just as the Gruthan flagship entered. The dreadnought's remains collapsed inward, crushing the Gruthan ship under tons of twisted steel and ancient armor plating. The shockwave knocked the rust bucket spinning into the void, but when the stars steadied again, the flagship was gone, buried forever in the wreckage of a war long past. Silence returned to the graveyard at last, broken only by the crackle of fires and the drifting remains of ships that had come seeking treasure and found only death. Jack slumped back in his seat, exhaustion washing over him. Sarah turned to him, her eyes wide with disbelief and awe. "We did it," she said softly. Jack managed a tired smile. Yeah, kid, we did. But he knew it still wasn't over. There would be others, more hunters and raiders, more enemies drawn by greed and pride. But for now, for this moment, they had won. They had survived, and Jack would take that victory gladly. He reached over and ruffled Sarah's hair, and she laughed, a sound that, for the first time in days, was pure and unburdened. The rust bucket turned slowly away from the wreckage, engines sputtering but still alive, carrying them toward the next challenge, whatever it might be. And Jack promised himself that no matter what came next, he would be ready. No rank, no mercy, only a father and his daughter, standing together against the galaxy. ChatGPT said. The rust bucket drifted through the cold dark after the battle, its hull scorched and pitted, its systems barely holding together with makeshift repairs and duct tape patches. Inside the cockpit, Jack sat in silence for a long time, hands resting on the controls but eyes unfocused as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. But even in this stillness, his mind stayed sharp because he knew the fight was not truly finished. Word of the Graveyard Massacre would spread fast and wild. Pirates and bounty hunters who survived would tell tales, twisting them until Jack became a legend, an unstoppable ghost piloting a junk ship through impossible odds. But legends had a way of painting a target on your back, and Jack was sure that somewhere, more enemies were already planning their next move. He could not rest. Not yet. Sarah sat beside him, wrapped in an old blanket and sipping from a dented flask of water, her face streaked with grime and sweat, but her eyes shining. She asked what they would do now, where they could go. Home was no longer an option. Earth might have felt safe once, but Jack knew the moment they returned, someone would come looking, dragging Sarah back into chains, or putting a price on both their heads even higher than before. Home was gone. The entire galaxy felt smaller, darker, more dangerous. Jack smiled at her quietly and told her the truth. Wherever we go, they will come, he said. But that does not mean we stop. It means we get smarter. The ship jolted suddenly, an alert flashing on the console. A beacon was transmitting ahead of them, a distress call from a civilian transport drifting near a small gas giant. It was an old trick, one Jack had seen before, probably a pirate ambush disguised as a cry for help. For a brief second, Sarah looked hopeful, suggesting maybe they could answer it and rescue whoever was aboard. Jack hesitated, but then shook his head. Not this time. The galaxy was not a place for heroes anymore. At least, not heroes who could afford to take risks. Every second wasted here gave the next hunter time to catch up. But even as he made that decision, a part of him hated it, hated what this fight had turned him into. He pushed those thoughts down. Later, when Sarah was safe, he could afford guilt. Not now. He adjusted their course, taking them toward a remote fringe system that few traders visited, a place where he could repair the rust bucket and maybe catch a breath. But he had underestimated how quickly news of the graveyard fight had traveled. As soon as they entered orbit around the icy moon where he hoped to land, sensors lit up with hostile contacts. For ships this time, fast and armed, approaching from all sides. This was no ragged group of bounty hunters. This was a squadron, coordinated, careful professionals who had studied his every move. The leader hailed him almost immediately, their voice smooth and cold. Over the comm, "You fought well," the voice said. "But this ends here. Hand over the girl, and we'll let you live." Jack knew they were lying. He also knew he could not outrun them this time. The rust bucket was too damaged, too slow. But Jack was not out of ideas yet. He turned to Sarah, his voice calm but firm. "We're not going to run," he told her. "We're going to fight smarter." He instructed her to strap in and take control of one of the manual systems, a primitive targeting array that was nearly useless in a fair fight, but could still lock onto specific debris fields in orbit around the moon. Jack guided the rust bucket lower, skimming the moon's atmosphere, weaving through ice fields and storms while the squadron closed in. The enemy ships moved with perfect discipline, surrounding him, forcing him toward a trap. But Jack was counting on their discipline. Discipline made them predictable. At just the right moment, he gave Sarah the order. She triggered the targeting array, locking onto a dense debris field in low orbit, remnants of an old mining station destroyed long ago. Jack fired a single pulse from the main gun, striking the largest fragment dead center. The resulting explosion sent a shower of ice and metal outward in all directions. The enemy squadron, perfectly positioned in their encirclement, was caught completely off guard. Fragments ripped into their hulls, disabling engines and tearing through cockpits. In moments, 2 of the 4 ships were reduced to spinning wrecks, while the other 2 limped away, badly damaged, their pursuit broken. Sarah whooped again, her laughter almost wild. "You did it again," she cried, and Jack smiled tightly, though inside he felt only grim satisfaction. It was never going to be easy. He knew that. But every victory bought them a little more time, a little more distance from the forces chasing them. And with each fight, the legend of Jack and Sarah grew. The galaxy would keep sending hunters. They would keep coming. But Jack did not care. He leaned back in his seat and tapped the cracked photograph still taped to the dash, the one showing Sarah as a child, her smile bright and untroubled, long before this war had begun. The rust bucket limped away from the moon, its engines groaning but holding together. Jack knew they would need real repairs soon. Supplies too. But he was no longer thinking only about running. He was thinking about the next step. If the galaxy wanted to treat him as a legend, then he would become one. Not hiding, not running, fighting back. A campaign of disruption, sabotage, hitting the raiders and slavers where it hurt most. And he would teach Sarah everything he knew. No more waiting to be hunted. They would become the hunters. Sarah turned to him and asked where they would go next, and Jack answered with a grin. "Wherever they least expect us. The galaxy is big and full of monsters. But now the monsters know we are out here too." As the stars stretched around them, the rust bucket disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind another ruined squadron and a name that would soon become a warning whispered across every pirate den and bounty hunter bar. Jack was no longer just a man. He was a force, a shadow, a myth. No rank, no mercy, just a father and daughter moving through the stars, impossible to predict, impossible to catch, and impossible to defeat. And as Sarah leaned back in her seat, laughing quietly and watching the stars blur by, Jack allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that for now, she was safe. And that was all that mattered.